Welcome to today's presentation of the vessel Overturned, Current Views on Hong Kong Christians' Civic Life. My name is Father Michael Agliardo. I'm the Executive Director of the U.S.-China Catholic Association, and I'm one of the hosts of this evening's event. Our presenter, Dr. Lida Nedilsky, is a scholar who has been following developments in Hong Kong's civic life for the past 2 decades and more. As Hong Kong made the transition from British to Chinese rule, she listened to its people and gathered their experience in her first book, Converts to Civil Society. She has continued to follow involvement of Hong Kong's churches in the civic life of this thriving port city. We are privileged to have her share her thoughts and insights on what has become a very timely topic. And we thank you for joining us. This presentation is part of an ongoing series exploring Christianity and culture in China today and yesterday. This series is a collaborative effort of 3 organizations: the U.S.-China Catholic Association, China Source, and the China Academic Consortium. The goal of this series is to explore the role of Christianity in the cultural dialogue between China and the West. Most discussions of globalization involve emphasize its economic dimensions. For example, that cotton for a pair of jeans may be grown in one country, sewn together in a second, and worn in yet a third. In fact, globalization is taking place on many levels, and religion has been involved in this dynamic process from the outset, humanizing some of its harsh contours. In this series, we explore the role of human values rather than merely monetary ones in the interchange between 2 great civilizations, China and the West. This series explores the role of Christianity in the cultural dialogue between China and the West, and it does so from a number of angles. We look at both historical and contemporary developments. We take into account both Protestant and Catholic experience. Our mission is to build fraternal relations between the Catholic communities in China and the US. We do this in a number of ways. In non-pandemic times, we sponsor study tours which bring Christians from the US to China to better understand its culture, its contemporary circumstances, and the life of the church there. We sponsor biennial conferences to bring scholars, members of the church in China, Chinese Catholics in the US, and non-Chinese Catholics who share our mission. These conferences allow the opportunity to learn, share insights, and network with one another. Our next conference will take place this August at Santa Clara University. It will feature keynote speakers from China, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who has written extensively on faith in the Middle Kingdom, panels on Chinese and Christian spirituality and the history and contemporary circumstances of the faith in China, updates on Protestant and Catholic communities in China, an art exhibit, and much more. We also sponsor this speaker series, annual talks in parishes across the country, a newsletter, and numerous other initiatives to keep the U.S. Catholic community informed of the circumstances of the church in China. This is really a sign of hope. It attests to the confidence that Chinese parents and Chinese leaders place in American educational institutions. And it is an opportunity for people in the U.S. to build relations based on friendship, trust, mutual respect, and shared values. The China Association has begun building a network committed to welcoming Chinese international students and enhancing their engagement, especially with the best of Catholic liberal arts education. You can find out more about all these programs of the China Association by visiting our website and signing up for our newsletter.
Hi, my name is Martha Chan. I'm the coordinator of the China Academic Consortium. I'm also the founding president of Educational Resources Referrals China, abbreviated is ERR China. We have been placing Christian teachers teaching the universities in China for 36 years. Before pandemic, we have about 30 teachers every year in China, and I visit China every year, and then I also do cross-cultural training. And China Academic Consortium is academic arm of ERR China. We started in 1996 when Peking University started their first religious studies program. And CAC, China Academic Consortium, focused on equipping and engaging with the Chinese Christian scholars and the university faculty members. We sponsored international conferences, translations of relevant theological books, and provided scholarship for lay theological training. CAC also offered intensive Chinese worldview seminar and co-sponsor this public lecture. And then through these kind of activities, we seek to empower the Western Christians to engaging with the Chinese culture. If you want to learn more about Chinese worldview seminar, you can go on for our website. It's www.erchina.com/CAC. We are going to be also sponsor this seminar in November. Is in Chinese. It's going to be a Chinese modern history. The speaker will be Dr. John Barrick from the Cornell University. So this slide is about our Chinese worldview seminar. So it's going to be held online in April, but then in the past, we always held this seminar in Beijing and Xi'an in China. Myself, Hong Kong is sort of my second home because I'm married to a person from Hong Kong. And then, so I'm looking forward to have a time when the breakout room, and then we will be able to talk more. And I'm really looking forward to Dr. Linda's presentation about Hong Kong. Thank you.
Good evening from cold Minnesota, although it's a little warmer here. It's been above freezing for a couple of days, so we're all very happy. I'm very happy to join you tonight and be a part of this, this lecture series. My name is Joanne Pittman, and I am the Vice President for Partnerships and China Engagement for ChinaSource. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with ChinaSource, we educate and inform the global church on critical issues facing the church and ministries in China. We seek to help people understand the complexities and the multidimensional nature of churches in China. And we do this through online publications on our website, chinasource.org, through consultations, through training programs, and through consulting. And we also seek to be a place where the global church can hear directly from Chinese Christians about their situations and challenges, thereby giving a chance for the global church to learn from our brothers and sisters in China. And you can learn more by visiting our website. We do publish something new on our website every day, Monday through Friday. And you can subscribe to get email in to get our publications or to get our posts into your email every day, or you can subscribe to one and get all of them in one shot. But we invite you to check out our website at chinasource.org, where you'll encounter a lot of interesting articles and posts about the situation in China today. And I'm happy to say that in June, we will be hosting the next lecture in this series that that's part of a collaboration between the China Catholic Association and the China Academic Consortium. And that lecture will be held on June 10th. It's going to be a virtual event as well. And the topic is Christian theology in a Chinese idiom, reshaping the conversation. And the presenter for that lecture will be Dr. Jesse Sakati, who holds a PhD in comparative philosophy from Hong Kong Baptist University and an MA in Chinese philosophy from Wuhan University. And he and his family lived in China for many years. And I'm very excited about getting Jesse to do this, because when I was living in China many years ago, I did orientation for English teachers who were coming to China, and he came to China as a newbie. And I always like to say I was his Chinese teacher. I taught him how to say ni hao, hello. And now he has a PhD in Chinese philosophy. So very excited about that upcoming event on June 10th. So we'll be sending out more information as we get closer to that event. So very excited to be here tonight.
Dr. Lida Nedilsky is a professor of sociology at North Park University in Chicago. Her focus is China. She has paid particular attention to the people of Hong Kong, the communities of faith there, and their involvement in public life. In this presentation, she also reflects on the role of the internet as a medium for mutual engagement. She published an early account of her research in 2014 in the volume Converts to Civil Society, which I mentioned earlier. This year, she contributed to Citizens of Two Kingdoms, Civil Society and Christian Religion in Greater China, which is published by Brill. Among her many involvements, she serves on the Academic Advisory Board of Tripod, a publication of the Holy Spirit Study Center in the Diocese of Hong Kong. I have known Lida Nedilsky since we were both grad students together many years ago on the La Jolla campus of the University of California. In that primitive era of times gone by, people actually got together in person. It was a simpler era. While at UCSD, we both studied under Professor Richard Madsen, who encouraged his students to integrate faith, values, and civic life into their sociological pursuits. And so now it is my great pleasure to present Dr. Lida Nedilsky.
Thank you so much. I'm going to be using the screen share for slideshow. And so if you just give me a moment, again, I'm very grateful to be with you tonight and to have a chance to share not only images from Hong Kong from March of 2020, not quite a year ago, but also my own perspective as a sociologist. So I want to preface by saying my professional adult life has been shaped by what's happened in Hong Kong. And yet my passion for understanding China goes even farther back. And so it's going to be wonderful to have many different views represented tonight. So the presentation that I'm giving, I've entitled The Vessel Overturned, Current Views on Hong Kong Christian Civic Life. So let me start by telling you something about my background and my particular perspective. Let's deal with the perspective first. While exploring the London Missionary Society archives back in 2012, I came upon correspondence from the early 1950s that caught my attention. Foreign missionaries to China were writing to one another and to their families, and these documents were stored in the archives. And they were writing about recently introduced policies by the government of the People's Republic of China that would shut the door on missionary activity. Once a missionary left the country for furlough, rejoining family, friends, and church, that person would not be allowed to return. This policy not only guaranteed an early expulsion of foreign missionaries and an orderly expulsion of them, depending on when their furloughs were scheduled, but it also paved the way for a three-self-patriotic movement and the consolidation of religious life under the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, and as it relates to the work that I do in Hong Kong, it reshaped Christianity in Hong Kong by pouring diverse missionary activity into one concentrated vessel. Ironically, that very concentration caused Christianity's dispersal, like a vessel overturned. Let me underscore this idea of a vessel overturned. Hong Kong is filled with different varieties of Christianity coming from different parts of the world and concentrated into one small, dense space. Holding such variety, I suggest, makes it very hard to keep people together, to keep them contained. There's energy. There's commitment in many forms. There's movement of mind, body, and spirit. It's a very dynamic environment for Christianity, and it's one that has a tendency to spill out. Now, something of myself that you should know. Not so much that I've been mistaken as a missionary, but that's true. 20-something studying language in Taiwan back in 1990, just 3 years after the lifting of martial law there, if you could account for my presence, if I wasn't a missionary. I am a Ukrainian Catholic. And that's a very unique form of Catholicism, a very recent and kind of privileged alternative to the Roman Catholic Church, and yet part of the Roman Catholic community. A Ukrainian Catholic spending time in the generous company of Maryknoll fathers in Taichung, I could appreciate missionary life and partake, for the one time in my life, I believe, partake in the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, Vjedinu Sviatu Sobornu i Apostolsku Cerkvu. It was my one chance to understand what that meant. But it wasn't until this past year that I related to the London Missionary Society's predicament of purpose. Missionaries move between places of commitment, of community. And as a sociologist, I have spent the last 24 years moving between the United States and Hong Kong. I've watched friends pursue their education. I've seen them in their work lives, building families, raising them, and dealing with all kinds of struggle. And I experienced a predicament of purpose when the coronavirus pandemic emerged. Would I be allowed back to see my friends? And when other developments, political developments emerged, those same questions were dogging me. Now, I don't have a full view of my screen, but I've constructed a timeline just to give you a sense of the events of my shared life with Hong Kong Christians. I was born in 1969 when I began to experience life in mainland China, in Taiwan, in Hong Kong. I was already in college and in my graduate studies by the time I was studying about Hong Kong. So our lives, our shared lives, are in many ways represented by this timeline with simple icons to mark the significant moments. 1984's joint declaration between Great Britain and China to set the framework for a peaceful transfer of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty. My first visit to China, to Fudan Daxue in Shanghai, was in 1988, the year after people in Hong Kong took to the streets to support people in China who were calling for democracy. And they experienced tremendous regret, tremendous struggle with their Christianity after the events of June 4th. I returned to Hong Kong in 1996 to begin my research about the impending transfer of sovereignty on July 1st, 1997. And then I would continue to come back to Hong Kong occasionally, often missing by moments, by months, some of the most dramatic events. SARS, another pandemic, emerged in 2003 in springtime, and I was there in late summer in August. I had also missed big demonstrations responding to government efforts to define Article 23 of the Basic Law, expressing explicitly the crimes of treason, of secession, of sedition. I would miss the umbrella movement of 2014, and my friends would be consumed by events of 2019. And so by 2020, it was essential for me to find my way back. So returning to Hong Kong under COVID conditions meant that streets are empty, a lot of families are indoors, and restaurants are closed or limited in their hours, and that there's a lot of stress, a lot of new stress that people are facing on top of everything that they had been consumed by before. And I want to just start with an image of almost an empty street, almost an empty slate, actually, to point out that in Hong Kong, people pass by familiar places day after day after day. And usually there's a lot on their minds, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of movement and distraction. And under COVID, those things were removed, as well as important signs of public life. And it became a matter of people remembering what had been there instead. And so my time with Hong Kong Christians, both Protestant and Catholic, was about them taking me and explaining what had happened in various places. A totally different kind of tour from the typical Hong Kong visit. My guides, masked people, were Catholics and Protestants both, academics, educators, social workers, NGO workers, clergy, civil servants, politicians, people in their 20s into people in their 80s, a variety of people. And yet, by all means, the vast majority of people I have known in Hong Kong have been involved passionately in public life and in democratic practices. So it's these people who took me on tours of the city and showed me the places that mattered to them and the signs that mattered to them. And one of the first signs that anyone saw back in March of 2020 were calendars, dates of significance, dates that had become like 6/4 and 7/1 iconic elements that guided people's calendar, that dictated their activities, their rituals, that urged them to gather every month at a particular place to mark a particular event. Moving people with these dates. These dates would be accompanied by icons. Now, icons tell stories in a very simple and formulaic way. Sometimes we forget, because we have icons on our phones, that iconography has a very important place in religious life. Certainly it does in the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And so seeing images, seeing them once, you begin to see them everywhere around Hong Kong. And in this period again, March of 2020, the city was experiencing restrictions on movement, restrictions on gatherings, but without the consequences more recently associated with the national security law. And everywhere throughout the city, there would be posters and stickers, some of them torn, some of them placed afresh, but reminding people of events that some people didn't want to remember and some people could not forget. Supplementing these constant images, these icons, there are also new and engaging and often humorous posters mocking certain politicians, reminding people of dates like 7/21. sorry, I didn't realize that there's, again, some issue with the microphone. The date of the Yunlong train incident. So these Lenin walls would be posted and then they would be torn down. And the police began to come down harder on folks as they posted posters. So a network of neighborhood residents would become part of groups with special apps on their phones so that they could notify artists of any police in the vicinity and protect them as lookouts so that they could get their posters up. And then a few days later, those posters would be taken down again. Now, this is the very same wall that I showed you as a kind of blank slate in Fortress Hill neighborhood of Hong Kong. And I arrived in the neighborhood on a Saturday, and by Monday, the wall was covered with posters. So it involved, again, a coordination. It involved people using their technology. It was a game of cat and mouse, and also a game of ever-changing ideas being presented, including ideas about how to spend money in Hong Kong. So one of the specific posters that I photographed, the one that's here on the right-hand side, showing phone app icons as its subject, represents the yellow economic circle. Maybe some of you have read about the yellow economic circle in Hong Kong, but it's a guide to consumption for people with ideas about who supports democracy and who doesn't support democracy. Your phone app can direct you to restaurants and bookstores and other kinds of shops where owners have given food, for example, or shelter, or water, or sold sensitive books, or displayed pamphlets by those who have been involved in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. And in a time of coronavirus, again, this is extremely significant because when you have limited opportunity to spend money, that money can sustain a business, or it can reduce a business's ability to stay afloat. So it's more than just a choice or an expression. It's also an impactful economic consequence, this yellow circle economy. In addition to the apps that tell people where to buy, there are also platforms, retailers online that guide you in spending on behalf of those people who are in situations of vulnerability. Maybe it's a young protester whose parents are no longer willing to have their child live with them, and they are limited in their resources. They're vulnerable in terms of arrest. And so these platforms like Guangxi allows people to support some of the vulnerable by buying gift cards. The gift cards can be used for ordinary food items like instant noodles or hand sanitizer or very basic kinds of non-perishables. These gift cards and these kinds of online retailers also offer equipment for purchase. They can be t-shirts, they can be N95 masks or helmets. Those have been products that made available in that yellow economic circle. In addition, you can buy artwork, journalists' work. You can buy food items that are handmade in Hong Kong or Taiwanese-made products rather than buying products from mainland China. So this whole yellow circle economy establishes a way for the politically motivated to sort of circle their wagons and create a system where resources are being used within and groups that are vulnerable are being sustained through a collective effort. Now, I can't be confused for a tourist when I'm in Hong Kong. that hasn't been the case for a very, very long time. And yet to have a pilgrimage, I think, is today increasingly something that my friends have drawn me to do with them. These pilgrimages are not to religious sites, but to sites of significance, again, in their lives and our shared lives together in the time that we've been working together and studying together and visiting homes together in Hong Kong. So when on the streets are empty of signs and empty of human life, we fill the scene with memories. We resurrect the sounds and the smells of tear gas, of people moving in unison, working to transport water bottles across great distances. These are images and impressions that Hong Kong people carry with them and fill the empty voids with. Likewise, looking at a simple map of the subway and train system in Hong Kong, one can do that for the simple purpose of navigation. But increasingly today, these sites are also markers of events, often traumatic events. Even in March of 2020, the stations in Wangkok were still boarded up with wooden planks where glass had been and glass had been broken, right? Still in the subway station in Fortress Hill, there were ticket machines that were broken and one after the other was broken. So these kinds of remnants and memories of the moments of violence and destruction, right, that were part of the protests are now significant sites of pilgrimage as well. And so one of my friends took me to places that we had experienced together many times before. I had lived in the neighborhood of one of these MTR stations, these subway stations, where violence took place at the end of August in 2019. I had been a student studying at Chinese University, where again, there was extreme intensity in the demonstrations and violence. And the remnants of that intensity weren't removed. The buses were still there with graffiti. Students' artwork and messages were still posted on the bulletin boards. The overpass that had become a site of vulnerability for drivers below was blockaded and guarded. And this became the way that we walked along together into the past, not only the past of laughter and early friendship, but also a more recent past of intense debate and even violence. Now, sometimes these sites themselves almost come alive and make a different impression on us. I have here a picture of the Methodist Church of Hong Kong. And when I first arrived to do my research for the handover experience in 1996, 1997, the Methodist Church was one of the first that I passed, and I thought I should know what they're about. I'll go inside and take some material. Maybe this is an important place. And it turned out that no one with whom I had contact in that first year of research had a strong connection to the Chinese Methodist Church or had anything good to say about many churches in Hong Kong. And so it was interesting to me when I was on a tram with a friend who has had a lot of experience with Protestant education and with Catholic faith-based organizations, but who is not himself a Christian. And he pointed to the church and he said, you know, the Methodist Church was so important to us during the protests. It opened its doors and helped people. And my friend's wife said, and our son is going to be attending school at a Methodist school, in part because of the impression it made on us. A number of churches at the front lines of so many annual demonstrations, those churches that cluster on street level in the neighborhood of Wanchai just before you get into Admiralty, they labeled themselves in June of 2019 as repose stations where people could rest, regardless of whether they had faith or no faith, regardless of their political position or action, regardless of their need, they could enter, have rest, have peace, meditate on their actions. Along with the Chinese Methodist Church in Wanchai, the Church of Christ China in Wanchai, as well as Our Lady of Mount Carmel Catholic Church, those churches in June of 2019 announced that they would be repose stations. And this would have a huge impression on people involved in that street level protest. One last innovation that I think is so telling, that combines the elements that I've been talking about in terms of the way that Hong Kong people have been expressing civic life and also religious life in a time of intense conflict, is the role played by restaurants and stores in the yellow economy, the yellow economic circle, and some churches also in hosting elections for opposition candidates in the primaries that were conducted in July of 2020. And among the churches that played a role is a familiar one to me, the Kowloon Union Church at 4 Jordan Road. It labeled itself, it designated itself as a polling station, a site where people could come in order to cast their ballots, and 600,000 came to cast their ballots in a single weekend for opposition candidates ahead of the scheduled Legislative Council elections that were to be held in September of 2020. But at the end of July 31st, Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced that because of increased infection rates in COVID-19, the LegCo elections would be postponed for an entire year. So this was a moment of collaboration among very small and grassroots groups. Again, oftentimes using phones, not only to locate polling sites, but also to cast votes using smartphones. And the churches that people choose for worship become churches they choose to cast their ballot in. And there's a new element in what it means to have a church as a freestanding, privately owned entity. Typically in the United States, or at least here in Chicago, since that's where I do my voting, they're public places that are used for polling. Of course, there are arenas and other large venues that are important in supporting voting, but for the most part, the standard sites, at least here, are schools and libraries. In Hong Kong, instead, there were very small sites, private entities that pooled their resources together to create a network a system where voters could safely vote for an election that would, in retrospect, be deemed illegal. And this is very interesting to me as someone who studied how Christians in Hong Kong have identified election committee members from within their communities and have hosted informal elections to select the people who sit on a committee that selects the chief executive of Hong Kong. Those types of elections have not been called illegal. So the situation is ever changing. But what's interesting to me as a sociologist, I'm sharing my perspective through the eyes of my old friends who have invested years in giving what they thought is good for the society, not for their pocketbooks, for their children, for the future of this place. Those are emotional lessons. As a sociologist, when I look at the same situation, I think about how fluid people are, how they move, how they look, how they choose among diverse options. Christianity, remember at the beginning of my talk, I said Christianity is in Hong Kong a vessel that's filled with a variety of forms. And it's very hard to hold people in any vessel. They tend to move out, they tend to spill beyond and spill into new spaces. And this raises a challenge for the churches in Hong Kong and a challenge for everyone who cares about Hong Kong. What does the isolation of Hong Kong Christians from one another under COVID-19 mean for their church life, their civic life, their online life? Already moved in many different directions, not contained neatly in a single vessel, people have been cut off from one another. Worship of Mass has not been allowed in Hong Kong in order to deal with the dangers of COVID-19 in a publicly responsible way. Hong Kong people have had to surrender that ritual, that celebration. They have not been able, in many situations, to go into the office or into the school. Just as in the United States or Great Britain, there is reluctance, there is hesitation in coming back together. And then when people do come together, there's a need to pull away again. This creates a predicament. How do they return to each other? How will that return be managed, not just in terms of their health and a vaccine against the coronavirus? It's about dealing with everything else that they carry inside them as a consequence of what they've been experiencing. And I have an idea about at least how one Catholic church, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, might pursue this reunion that is anticipated. Because back in 2019 in June, when the church first opened its doors as a repose station, right, and welcomed non-believers as well as believers, Protestants as well as Catholics, pro-democracy as well as passionately pro-China protesters, whoever sought shelter, sought peace, sought relief, was welcome. And the pastor of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, Father Thomas Law, in the June news issue, right, that the parish put out, titled his communique, Number 1 Star Street, Our Staying Point. And in it, he addressed his parish about their responsibility. And there are two kinds of responsibility that he highlighted. One was the acceptance of new faces inside the church, not only in moments that coincided with protest, but even at Mass back in the summer of 2019, new faces would appear. People who were unknown, people who were not regulars, people who he called prodigal sons and neophytes. And one of the challenges was to accept their presence, regardless of who they were and what they did. The other challenge, he turned on his parishioners, and that's the staying point that he was emphasizing, not the repose station side, but the staying point, that his parishioners also needed to stay, to be fixed inside that community and not simply come and go at will or at their convenience, that they should perform a regular rhythm of life with that church. And one of the important roles that they should play is actually reaching out to the neophytes and instructing what it means to be a member of that church, to bring back, to refill the vessel. Because ultimately, he said, that is the way that peace is truly achieved. And that made me think even more about the peace that is necessary, the peace that we can anticipate will have to be built when COVID-19 is no longer the threat that it is, to the point where it prevents people from living with their commitment and their community. Navigating the streets of Hong Kong alone, right, on their own, means Christians carry so much as they find their way back to each other. And I have 3 sets of questions I want to end with. These are questions that I'm thinking about a lot. Hopefully there's something there that is meaningful for you as well. So the first one addresses church life directly. Church life without worship, right, is what people have been experiencing since COVID-19. And these restrictions are very, very powerful. They're not contested in the way that they have been in the United States. Different religious groups, people in Hong Kong have been conforming, churches have been conforming, except that doors are still open. Individuals can come into church on their own and pray, but there cannot be worship together. And so among these questions about church life, I ask, how do Christians mark their return to each other? Mark and maintain their personal awakenings in communion with Hong Kongers generally. There's a lot they've been thinking about, a lot they've been struggling with. This is not new to Christians in Hong Kong to reflect, to demand, to seek. But right now, it's on another level. And our churches, are Christians ready for that? What steps are churches taking to acknowledge and resolve the diverse ways Christians experienced and continue to reflect upon the past 12 months? What steps are churches taking to address a new family reunification problem? Back in 1997, 1998, the church was very concerned about family reunification, with children on one side of the border in China and parents on the other in some instances. Right? This is a different kind of family reunification problem, whether you understand it in a nuclear sense or society-wide. What are the churches doing to acknowledge and resolve? What role do clergy, theologians, teachers, and researchers see for themselves in handling this vessel overturned? Are there lessons that they still reflect upon 30 years hence? Because again, the situation isn't unique. The protests of 1989 brought many people out onto the streets in China, in many Chinese cities, not just Beijing, right? In Hong Kong. And then there was a silence, a disappointment for many people in terms of what messages, what guidance they were receiving from these leaders. What role can they perform today with the lessons of the past? Civic life is now restricted in very significant ways under the national security law that was introduced at the end of June in 2020. How do practices of civic life developed in churches, in charitable organizations, in non-governmental organizations, in schools and seminaries find expression in today's Hong Kong? When we read the newspapers, all of these fronts are feeling pressure. And yet, these are the very civil society organizations that have created solutions for so many different problems and empowered people to deal with life in so many ways. How will they find expression for that impulse? How do private initiatives continue to shape institutions, including elections, representative government, and the rule of law? And what version of history will citizens of Hong Kong, through various initiatives, commit to collective memory? Again, the history is being written now. It has been written. But what is the version that people will understand 20 years hence, 50 years hence? Are people willing to work together to craft that story? Finally, this online life, right, where all exists under both COVID-19 and national security concerns, with worship and protest, economy and elections, school, recreation, and scholarship done online, who will harness these trainings in participatory culture? Now, participatory culture is not my term. That's the work of Henry Jenkins, a theorist of technology and public life. Participatory culture describes a situation of learning that happens, right? Where we create as we commune with others at our level of ability with whatever we can contribute. This is what Hong Kongers realized so vividly across the months of 2019 and 2020, that they can learn different things from generations that they didn't consider ready to play a role in the public, or generations they thought were already too old to contribute in this particular moment in history. Yet these acts, these activities are sites of learning, of creating. I wonder who will harness that. You can't completely suppress it. It's so ingrained. If online participation is tolerated only for market gains as an economic act, I'm curious, how might that compromise or strengthen the other inspired activities that make a complete life, that speak to the many things that we can offer one another? And finally, again, inspired by the work of Henry Jenkins and other theorists of technology, those that consider carefully how diverse can be the community commitment if we can connect with each other beyond the physical connection, right? What role is there for the youth, the infirm, the confined, the vulnerable, the seekers and the scattered, those pressed to reinvent themselves or remove their families entirely? Because we know that many families have made plans, and yet they're torn. Is there a way that Hong Kong can continue to tap into the enthusiasm and commitment of people in the diaspora? As a Ukrainian Catholic, that's the only religious life I've known, is in the diaspora. And that diaspora then became the place to accept a new generation of immigrants, especially at a moment, at a time when it was so hard to sustain Ukrainian Catholicism. So that big picture, that long view on history is going to matter. And this is how I want to end my talk. I want very much to hear your questions and receive your feedback. So thank you. A question for Dr. Nedilsky from Lauren Pfister to everyone. Were policemen, policewomen also allowed into the repose stations? Were there any tensions within them when, if that occurred? So this is a very interesting question. I do have a friend who is in the police, actually is very pro-police in Hong Kong. And the repose stations, I think the idea of sanctuary is still significant in Hong Kong. The churches were not sites of conflict. I'm sure that this idea of sanctuary is familiar to many of us in the context of the United States, both in the 1980s and early 1990s, with asylum seekers coming from Central American countries. And more recently, sanctuary has been offered asylum seekers in Texas in the context of the Trump administration. So these churches, these repose stations, they were not sites of conflict. That threshold was respected. I have not heard of any instance where it was not respected. Dr. Nedilsky, what is Martin Lee's current status? Is he still involved in the protest movements? Martin Lee was among those arrested, and he said that it took him a long time to be arrested. He feels rather proud. He's in his 80s, and he felt that the young people can handle being arrested, and now it's his turn as well. So he is definitely involved, and yet people are awaiting trial, and we haven't seen the consequence of that cycle of detention, trial, and judgment. There have been some small scale actors that were arrested and tried for carrying symbols of independence. And there were many people in the context of 2019 that were placed into detention centers all around Hong Kong. Some of my friends, again, remarked on the proximity of these prisons to where they live, and the fact that so many young people were held there. It was a very disturbing situation from their vantage. Will there be a change in the status of religious freedom? Well, the change is happening let me start with this response first. When I was in Hong Kong in 2001, Hong Kong at that time, the chief executive's office, it wasn't the chief executive, but member of the office was setting up a proposal for an anti-cult law. I don't know if you heard of it. There are many countries that have anti-cult laws. And for us as Americans, we might be shocked that France names some 50 different groups as cults. I think even Baptists are included on their list. and they do not recognize them as religions and therefore have special ordinances that limit their activities. So back in 2001, there was a push to establish an anti-cult law, and religious leaders were invited to help define what is religion as opposed to cult. And religious leaders soon realized that so much of what religious people do can be misconstrued as superstitious or irrational, and they could be labeled cults, whether it's an idea of celibacy or of charity. Many people in Hong Kong might consider that just bizarre behavior and cult-like behavior. So the religious leaders basically agreed not to participate in labeling themselves as a religion, because that would subject their practices to scrutiny and possibly extend the label of cult to themselves. So there are other ways that religious life is being constrained, right? Not only is it a matter of, under COVID-19, the restrictions on actual worship, which can be justified in the name of public health, public safety, but the running of schools, so many, in addition to Methodists and Catholics, you know, Church of Christ China has so many schools in Hong Kong. Many different groups, you know, will be under constraints about how they can teach, what they can teach, and it's definitely a slippery slope on that front. So this is going to be very important. Many in Hong Kong are faith-based, especially with the Anglican Church. So what is the Anglican? I don't know exactly what an individual church is doing on this issue. Again, when the general framing of cult versus religion was established back in 2001, then groups quickly mobilized to discuss it. But the condition of government was different. Already, there are new proposals that will not come from Hong Kong government, but from the Chinese National People's Congress, that will require any potential candidate for public office in Hong Kong to establish their patriotism. And Hong Kong's politicians at first were saying, well, this is something, you know, that Hong Kong should be able to do and resolve. And then it became clear that it won't even be a matter for Hong Kong government to address. So this is a huge change since, you know, the national security law was established, instituted by the National People's Congress. Now this would be a second intervention. For every reaction, but an incident happened at Holy Cross. So these are not questions, this is chat amongst yourselves. Were you aware that a lot of the protesters were paid to participate in the protests? That's a very interesting charge, considering, again, that I have worked with a broad, not a broad political base, but a broad section of ages and professions across decades in terms of the work that they've done. So that would require a lot of documentation. Many feel it's the Hong Kong legislature that's at fault for not working out the security law way before the current. This is an interesting point. So because the legislature, the LegCo, is not deemed fully democratic, a portion of its members have been elected by functional constituencies and others by geographic constituencies. And there has been a cap at the number of legislators elected by territorial constituency, direct one person, one vote. So it's been in those moments when national security law legislation was being open for debate that Hong Kong people took to the streets because they don't have representation in the Legislative Council, not enough to actually deal with that issue. So this is why we've had exactly at those times when national security law issues were being debated, an alternative expression of political position. And on, I think, Father's Day in June of 2019, 2 million Hong Kong people came with their children, right, with their parents, with their spouses onto the street for that demonstration, the largest one in Hong Kong history. So Joshua Wong, among other leaders, are Christian. Are most Hong Kong Christians pro-democracy? This is a very interesting question. So one thing that I've realized in doing my research about Hong Kong is that oftentimes there is an idea that a church has a position or that a person represents a faith and a position. But again, the idea of a vessel overturned suggests that there is tremendous agitation and movement. And it is certainly not to say that, I mean, no research has been done, no polling has been done to determine what proportion. We only have individuals who are moved by their faith, often even to criticize the church, right? Often even to underscore the injustices and failures of the church. Does that stop them from being Christian, or does that make them more Christian? I think there's so much to unpack there. Cardinal Zen publicly made his position known. He has been very consistent. This is very interesting because before people knew Cardinal Zen and his particular contributions, back in 1996, 1997, I asked my Catholic friends, and they were concerned. There's an idea sometimes, again, faith is very complicated and theology even more. There's often an idea that someone who is illiberal in certain political questions, like Cardinal Ratzinger before he became Pope Benedict, Hong Kong people who had politically liberal views thought that Cardinal Ratzinger was an extremely unhelpful, unsympathetic, and an impossible leader to follow. And then his positions, once they became clear on other issues of importance, swayed them in the opposite direction. So I think that there's, again, tremendous investigation to do into the dynamics of people's faith, not just a single expression in a moment, but to understand just how much we seek to have guidance, and yet the positions that leadership takes are not constant and are not consistent, or they are constant, but they're inconsistent in the way that they match up with our own desires. And that's one of the reasons why, again, there's so much agitation. This is a moment of agitation because people seek some sense of hope.
I was very interested in that yellow circle economy that you talked about, and I'm wondering if the churches were also part of that economy, in that people would list what churches' leadership positions are on the protests.
That is an amazing question. You know, can I have your email and I'll dig into that. I am not aware that people would put that information, that kind of information onto the app. I mean, I do imagine, because of what Father Thomas Law at the Mount Carmel church said, because he said all of a sudden there were these new faces on Sunday. And often, you know, again, in a time of intensity, even my friends who are not Christian in Hong Kong, but have an understanding because they've attended Christian schools or worked for Christian organizations, they intentionally go to church in those moments. And it's in many respects, it's by word of mouth. There are reputations, right? Reputations are established. But whether or not someone would go to the trouble and actually label and sort of sort the churches on whether they are yellow or they're blue, this is a very interesting question I didn't even consider.
Yeah, the reason I asked is that you mentioned that, I mean, in the church, such as big as the Catholic Church, I'm sure there are Catholics, pastors of different parishes that may or may not be pro-China or pro-democracy, and they may not let themselves known. For example, you mentioned about the Mount Carmel Church. My father goes to that church, and my father said that when he went to the church during the protest time period, the priest actually said, well, the priest refused to give a position on whether people should go protest. He just said that, well, you should go according to your conscience. And so my father was a little confused. I said, okay. Well.
Exactly. Some people want to be directed. Some people want to create a situation where you can have reconciliation, or you can have, you know, your cake and eat it too. Whatever the impulse is, there will be those who seek to find a middle way. And the question, you know, is that what is necessary in Hong Kong right now? How are Hong Kong theologians and priests and ministers talking about this among themselves in anticipation of this moment? What are they willing to do? What are they ready to do? Because the alternative is for people to not attend.
Yeah, I mean, it's no quick answer. Thank you very much.
I'd just like to take this opportunity right now, if there are no further questions at this present moment, to thank Dr. Nedilsky for what I thought was a beautiful presentation, one that moved beyond simply the political issues that get people caught up in the stratosphere to help us understand some of the movements of the soul, some of the concerns of local people, some of how it impressed and worked into the ordinary lives of people who have been caught up in a historical moment. So I'd like to thank her for taking the time to share her own personal journey as well, and weaving that into her presentation as also a person of faith and a person of the Universal Church. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in the China Association for assisting in promoting this presentation. Bernard Cernick, who worked to make many of the arrangements and coordinate our participation, and Chen Xin, who coordinated so many of the technical details. It's a privilege to work with the both of them. As I mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, and I gather that some of my words were garbled, I apologize for that. But this event is part of an ongoing series sponsored by the China Association, the China Academic Consortium, and China Source to highlight the vital role that faith plays in promoting dialogue, mutual respect, and the common good in the relationship between China and the West. I'd like to also express my very sincere gratitude to Joanne Pittman, Senior Vice President of ChinaSource, and to the ChinaSource team, and to Martha Chan, President of the China Academic Consortium, and to all the people at the CAC for their work on behalf of this speaker series and tonight's event. I'd like to thank all of you also for joining us this evening.